Welcome to another edition of MissTrial, our brand new hit podcast with me, Karen Agnifilo, Kathleen Rice, and Danya Perry. We are so thrilled today to be joined by George Conway III, who is a good friend and just somebody who I love to follow on social media and is one of the smartest lawyers I know. So, George, we are so thrilled to have you on the pod so that we can pepper you with questions of all things involving all the intersection of law and politics that are going on today. I know what I want to talk to you about, which involves the Supreme Court and what the heck is going on there. But the rest of us, we have so many questions. I'm sure we might want to kick it off and start with the recent trial that the two of you attended, Danya and George. And I don't know if this is the first time you've seen each other or talked since you were both in court. I'd love to just hear what you have to say about it.
Yeah, well, George, you just want, that was kind of an open-ended question, unlike some of the ones that Susan Hoffinger directed at my client.
Yeah, the thing that has gotten me all exercised. It got me exercised during the trial and has now gotten me more exercised after the trial was the coverage of it. And in particular, the moment I kind of realized that people were getting a misleading impression of that trial was sitting in the courtroom during, I guess it must have been the second day of Michael's cross, of your client's cross, and listening to Blanche go after Michael all morning, almost kind of randomly, but, doing all the stuff everybody said that was, that anybody was going to do to Michael, like go back through his history, the things he pleaded to, any false statements he made. And, I didn't think it was particularly well done. And my particular view of cross, I'm not a criminal. I've never been a criminal lawyer, but I've done civil cases and spent a lot of time taking depositions where you really do learn how to cross-examine witnesses. And I just thought it was ineffective because it was just, there was a lot of screaming at the witness, there were a lot of long questions, and it moved around a lot. And I thought that the most effective way, and this isn't really the point I'm going to make, but it leads to it. To cross Michael would have been to make it much more simple and just say, you said this, that was not true. You pled to this, you did this, you did that. Just really short questions where he was just going to say, yes, yes, yes. And then, you always break up like one question into 6 or 7, right? You said that, there's a 3-sentence paragraph and you say, well, you said this. 3 words, and these 3 words were false, and the next 3 words were false, and the next one. And I thought it could, that would have been the way to do it. But he was just meandering all morning, and none of it had anything to do, more importantly, with the case and whether or not Michael was telling the truth about things that related to the charges against Donald Trump. And then finally he got to something. Just before lunch, he hits on this October 24, 2016 conversation that we all know very well now, and that people who are following the trial know very well, where Michael had testified on direct that he had at one point on that day gotten in touch with the boss, Donald Trump, by calling Keith Schiller, and that was reflected in the phone records. And the defense had come up with an alternative theory based upon other documentary evidence other than the phone records, but text records suggesting that Michael, and he probably did, called Schiller and talked about something other than, or in addition to what he would talk to Trump about, what he said he talked to Trump about. And that kind of threw Michael off, I thought, a little bit. And because I guess he wasn't prepped on it. I know you're not going to comment on that. And, it was okay. It was a point for the defense. And I said, okay, all right. They got him there on there, but he's not really backing down. And frankly, he looked to me like he was kind of puzzled by it, which struck me as the reaction of a witness who was trying to get it right and trying to tell the truth, as opposed to somebody who would say, no, that didn't happen, and I'm sticking to my story, and F you, basically. But anyway, the point was, I thought it was a point for the defense. And the next thing I see is, texts about what's being said on television or tweets. And it turns out that even on CNN, someone was saying that this was a devastating moment. This is the end of the prosecution's case. The prosecution has committed malpractice. Like, this was just one point. Now, I was worried at that point. Don't get me wrong. I was worried that Blanche would come back after lunch with about 10 more of those, because that's the way you make effective cross-examination, is repetition, making the same point over and over again. And it's got to be on more than one thing, because there were so many things corroborating Michael's testimony. I thought, oh, finally he's getting to the meat to it. Oh gosh, if he's got more of this could be a problem for the prosecution. And then they come back in the afternoon, and it's just worse. The meandering, useless cross-examination that Blanche was conducting with the long questions and random order of topics and the yelling and whatever, it got worse with this it was like cross-examination of how many times Maggie Haberman of the New York Times had written about Mike. It was awful. And I thought at the end of the day, it's like, okay, they scored like a point, but they needed to put a lot more on the board. And I said as much on CNN, and it turned out I was right. But the people on television had gotten the misimpression that this was a really, really good day for the defense. It was like a good moment. It was the one good moment they basically had in the trial. But it was like, I was thinking, well, it was fixable. And suppose they talked to both. He talked to both Trump and Schiller. It wasn't that much he had to say to Trump, and that's exactly how they fixed it. And it turned out the jury blew right past it. But I really was disturbed. The point I'm making in too many minutes here is I was just disturbed at the coverage of that particular incident, and I thought it was emblematic of just how misleading, what a misleading impression people were getting of the case as it was going on, like it was some kind of that the outcome was at issue. I mean, I thought the defense never ever mounted a defense. I couldn't understand what the defense was. I couldn't see what the coherent theory of reasonable doubt was, and I thought the prosecution executed, except for that one issue where maybe Michael should have been prepped on that, flawlessly. So that's the thing that's the thing I've been left with after this trial, is just how bad the coverage was. And
I think you make a great point. And you were there every day, right? Almost?
Not every day, but I was there probably 25 to 40% of the time. I can't really do it. But I was there enough to get a feel of what was going on. And I was there for a couple of I was there during the Stormy Cross, which Susan Necklace did. And it was bad. And Necklace is a good lawyer, and she actually asked good questions, but I really think that the defense performance was hampered not just by the fact that factually they were overwhelmed and they really didn't have a story, but I just think they were performing for this guy who's a complete lunatic. And there was no point to them fighting Stormy on whether or not Trump and Stormy had sex. There was just no point to that, and no point to just beating up on her the way they did. And it just ended up all backfiring on him. I think he's his own worst enemy.
I have a question for you, because your background is in appellate litigation. You have argued before the United States Supreme Court, which, for those listeners that don't realize, that is the highest, most elite type of law you can practice. I've obviously never been before the Supreme Court, and most lawyers I know have never appeared before the Supreme Court. It's really this elite type of practice. In my defense, that's really kind of not my background. I mean,
but you have. I have argued a case,
and you were considered.
I did a good job.
You did a good job, and you were considered to be Solicitor General, which is the person who would argue on behalf of the United States and represent the United States in litigation before the Supreme Court. So I have a question for you.
Okay.
Given that you have some, I don't want to quibble over how much, but let's say, given you have some really high level appellate background, what are your thoughts on the current debates and coverage on the trial that this case has significant appellate issues? I'd love to hear your thoughts because, I personally have been in the media kind of going back and forth and with people who have a very different take on this trial after the fact. And but a lot of people don't think, or some people, I should say, just really have criticized the bringing of this trial to begin with. But one point they make, in addition to whether or not this case should have been brought or whether this case is important or significant, I obviously think it is this appellate question, and are there any substantive issues on appeal? And if so, what are your thoughts on that and whether they have any merit? I'd love to hear your thoughts on.
Yeah, I haven't heard a meritorious appellate argument yet. I mean, the only legal argument I've really heard is the contention that somehow the charge was, what didn't comply with New York law somehow. And I can't see it because basically the charge tracked the statutes. And I think it was a wise decision to focus the underlying offense part of the charge of first class.
What you're saying, so what basically the point you're making is that falsifying business records in the first degree is a felony. Right. There is a misdemeanor falsification of business records, and it's literally if you have the intent to
or conceal another offense.
Right.
And the offense, and I think the selection of that offense and focusing it in on the state election law violation and using that as an umbrella to bring in the other things that they did wrong and using them as unlawful means, it just tracks the statute. And I don't see how that raises an issue on appeal. I mean, if you believe in the interpreting language of statutes in accordance with their plain language, that's exactly what the judge did. That's exactly what the charge did. And I just don't see any basis for an appeal on that. And I don't see any basis for suggesting that somehow the jury wasn't informed what that underlying offense was, or what the unlawful means in support of that underlying offense, which was a violation of state election law, which says that it's unlawful to conspire to, influence or any election through unlawful means. And the unlawful means here were violations of the Federal Election Campaign Act, tax violations, and so on. So I don't know how they get around it. I think the legal theory was airtight, and the evidence was completely. I mean, there was just no alternative explanation of the documented facts. You can even set aside Michael's testimony. The documented facts. There's no explanation of why he signed those checks. Trump signed those checks, and for money he didn't actually owe. Michael grossed him up for taxes. I don't understand what other possible explanation was there other than they were committing tax violations and committing a violation of the Federal Election Campaign Act and knowingly covering it up. So I don't see the issue on appeal. And in terms of everything else, the evidentiary issues, I mean, you all know as prosecutors that it's so hard, even in civil cases, it's hard to overturn a verdict on the basis of an evidentiary ruling or even a group set of evidentiary rulings. And there was just nothing that Merchan cut them every bit of slack that they deserved, the defense. There were the complaint that they made after Stormy's testimony about how prejudicial it was. Well, problem is the defense, I mean, it wasn't, but defense opened the door as wide as possible for that level of detail, and there wasn't even that much about the affair, and it wasn't prejudicial. So I just don't see what issue it is they have on appeal. I just don't see it at all. And then, of course, they had this little bubble about a juror the other day, and they all went wild about that, and it was just stupid.
Well, that's the issue. There's so little there that when there is a tiny little kernel, everyone goes bananas and makes much of it. But I agree with you. I'm curious to see what Trump's appellate lawyers will say. I don't think that's going to be this team. I don't think it's going to be Todd Blanche. Much has been made of the fact that the judge did not require unanimity from the jurors on means and methods. Like, was this in service of an election fraud? Was it a tax fraud? And, I've looked at that issue. We surveyed hundreds of these kinds of cases for Brookings Institution report I co-authored. And as you said, George, this judge played it by the book. This was, this is the standard jury charge. And he refused to deviate from that for Donald Trump. But, a refusal to provide special treatment is certainly not grounds.
Yeah, I mean, as I've always understood it, and is that if you have a murder case and the charge is premeditated murder, and 6 people on the jury think it was done with a gun and 6 people think it was done with a knife, it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter.
Yeah,
because because use of the knife or use of the gun, it is not an element of the crime. The unlawful means is unlawful means. It doesn't mean a specific unlawful means. It can be any unlawful means, and frankly, here there were more than one. So I don't see it.
But this phenomenon, this overblowing of, this tiny possible grounds for appeal is, it goes back to what you were saying about observing the trial. I saw you in there. I saw a couple of clear-eyed folks like Norm Eisen back there, but then you would leave for the day and you'd see, this media circus, going absolutely bananas about point, like you said. And it really felt very surreal. It really felt like, were you in the same courtroom I was in? Because, and maybe you do have to observe it. Maybe some of these, these legal experts had not been in the same courtroom. Literally, maybe they were just, hearing about it from someone who was in the courtroom and didn't get the full flavor. But it did.
I think a couple of things were going on. I have a more granular theory of it, which is, first of all, when one person says something and it immediately, there's this tendency in the media to glom onto it, because nobody wants to be wrong. And so the first person out of the box when it comes to anything with a take that's not immediately demonstrably false, kind of intimidates and causes a stampede of journalists to go the other way. And I think the fact that it affected people who were in the courtroom, because when we were in the courtroom, I mean, I was sitting there, everybody who was accredited media had a laptop, and we were seeing in real time, not watching CNN, but we were getting in real time feedback from what was being said online or on television about what was happening. And I actually think that caused some people in the courtroom to misperceive what was happening and not be able to put it in context. And particularly the non-legal people, the non-legal journalists. So I think they were influenced by, misleading statements on CNN, which were in turn based upon just typing what happened, people just typing what was going, the language that was being used on the stand. And I think, not only did that not convey the atmospherics of what was going on, it didn't convey Michael's credibility, it didn't convey the ineffectiveness of Blanche overplaying his hand and screaming at Michael, and it didn't really capture the meandering and ineffective nature of Blanche's examination, both all day, frankly. So that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect of it is it ain't exciting. Blowouts aren't exciting. If one side is winning 34-0, it's like, so that's boring. People tune out. So I think anytime something happens where the other side gets a first down, that's like, whoa, they've really figured out the defense now. Here they come. And that's that kind of sports analogy, that kind of trying to create excitement about this trial, which was pretty exciting to begin with. But I think this tendency to want to make it a competitive match, even when it doesn't seem like it, when you're actually looking at it in the courtroom and thinking about it globally and thinking about all the evidence and trying to perceive the way a juror is watching this and not watching television. I think that was part of the problem. And my answer, I think, is this is why we need cameras in the courtroom.
I agree.
Totally.
Yeah.
This is why, because I think that if they had actually had cameras in the courtroom, people would have seen how ineffective Blanche's cross-examination of Michael Cohen was. Because if you put that on television and you watched it for 2 or 3 hours, you would have, you'd have turned on a soap opera. It was horrible.
Yeah.
And so
George, can I just jump in there for 1 second, George? Because, I hear what you're saying, but the good news is that the jury actually paid attention to Judge Mershaw's instructions and only based their decision on the facts. They clearly were not watching TV. But the reality is, even if there was a camera in that courtroom, the world we live in today, one side would have said, this is what you really saw. I know that you think you saw this, but this is what you really saw. And the other side would say this. And so it really gets to the point of messaging. And my constant beef with the Democratic Party is that they are terrible at messaging. And all you heard post-conviction from the Trump camp was rigged trial, kangaroo court, corrupt judge, and those very succinct messages stick. So take the media out of it and just look at how both sides, if you can put them into two camps, message what is going to be what we're going to hear for the next 6 months and why Republicans are so much better at actually sticking the landing, if you will. And saying and repeating things that stick with people, even though in the face of the reality that is completely different from that messaging.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's also part of it. I think the Republicans are much better. First of all, they lie. I think we've gotten to the point where the Republicans, and I know, as someone who was a Republican for 82 to 2018, 36 years, basically my entire adult life until 2018. It's distressing to say, but they've basically become addicted to lies. They've become completely indifferent to whether or not what they're saying has even a kernel of truth to it. And they simply rely on repetition of often misleading, tendentious, and often completely false statements and narratives. And I think that the only antidote to that is repeating the truth. Convicted felon, jury of his peers, and I just think that that's the only answer to it. And I do agree with you. I mean, even if there were cameras in the courtroom, there would be outlets that are just misleadingly clipping, because it's easier to clip the one moment where the lawyer is shouting, as opposed to the all day random gibberish that the lawyer is spouting out.
Well, and George, I mean, if you remember the most famous televised trial, O.J. Simpson, it encouraged those lawyers to lean into the theatrics of it with the glove and all of that. And so I agree that there should be a way for people to see what goes on in a courtroom, but how do you make it be the truth? How do you take the drama out of it? And
I agree with that. There's always going to be a problem there.
But also, I just want to go back to you leaving the Republican Party. Paul Ryan, a former colleague of mine, the former Speaker of the House, and a Republican from Wisconsin said, I am not a member of the Republican establishment anymore. Like MAGA is the establishment of the Republican Party. And I'm just curious, you're not that far away from being a Republican. Is there any way for, true establishment Republicans like Paul Ryan, like yourself, to take the party back, if Trump wins or if Trump loses? I mean, what do you see the future of the Republican Party being?
I think Trump is going to lose. I believe that. If he doesn't, well, we've got worse problems than the future of the Republican Party. We have the future of the planet at issue. But I think that the Republican Party is on the verge of potential collapse if Trump loses, for the following reasons. I think that, and I'm sure you know this, Kathleen, as somebody who has been in electoral politics, what's going on at the state level in the Republican parties is this incredible degree of dysfunction and comeback between some very, very insane people and some less insane people who are trying to appease the insane people. And I mean, the party in Michigan is basically self-destructing. The party in Arizona is self-destructing. These are obviously two critical swing states. And that, the capture of the party by people who are frankly unwell is happening throughout the state level, throughout the country. And at the federal level, the National Party has essentially been morphed into the Trump campaign. And that's happened by Trump installing his daughter-in-law as co-chair of the RNC, and by them firing a lot of people in Washington and moving the RNC operations down to Palm Beach to, in effect, and this is their stated intent, to merge their operations with the presidential campaign. And as you know, Kathleen, what happens to campaigns when the campaign is over, particularly if the campaign loses? They dissolve into thin air. Everybody, it's the next day, it's gone. There isn't even anybody to basically clean up the trash. And that's what the Republican Party is risking by having its national apparatus captured by Donald Trump. Because once that campaign is over, and then there's going to be nothing left of it. And Donald Trump's not going to care. I mean, he's not about the country. He's not even about his party. He's not even about, he even said the other day, or yesterday, that I don't care about you, talking to the voters in front of him. I just want your votes. I mean, that's all he cares about. All he cares about is running for president right now. And the reason why he's fundamentally running for president is because he wants to stay out of prison for the rest of his life. And once that purpose is defeated or served, I mean, once that party no longer serves its function for him, and once it's merged with that campaign that then disappears, I don't know that there's going to be much of a Republican Party left. And at that point, the real question is going to be, is there enough in the political landscape to start something new? Will there be a sufficient demand for, a center-right party, not for the purpose of just obstructing or defeating Democrats, but to serve the actual function that a political party, I think, in a healthy democracy should serve, which is to provide an alternative and to serve with their political opponents in support of democratically resolving disagreements we may have about how we all live together.
What happened in 2018 to cause you to?
I was just going to ask. We're talking about big, lofty, systemic, national problems, but I just want to know, the tea. What happened? What was it specifically in 2018 that turned you?
No, it was. Look, I mean, I was starting to turn. It's basically on January 20th, 2017. I'm wondering, what the F is wrong with this guy? And by the beginning of 2018, I had come to the conclusion, which is it's amazing to look back at it now. I mean, I said this, I think I even tweeted it at some point in 2018, 2019. The reason why I left the Republican Party is I thought then that it had become a personality cult. Then it was not a personality cult compared to the way it is today. But I thought then it was a personality cult. And it was. It's just we hadn't seen anything yet. I hadn't seen anything yet. How much worse it would become. And that's like, I mean, I think we've all become like the frogs in the boiling water. We don't many people just don't realize how far we've come in just a few years, to see the utter depravity and the utter degradation of an entire political party that has occurred in less than a decade. I mean, you can disagree about whether the Republican Party was good or bad before then, but compared to today, it was a functioning political party, and it had some healthy aspects to it. It had some unhealthy aspects to it, but frankly, all political parties have problems within them. That's a again meandering answer to a question. But the question was, why did I become a Republican? Because I thought then in 2018, we had a personality cult going on.
Yeah.
I talk too much.
No. It's just it's just fascinating, right? That obviously you moved to Washington, D.C., I think, when he was elected, so that your family could participate.
My ex-wife was then, my now ex-wife was working in the White House, obviously, for him. She won that campaign for him.
You notice that eye roll right there.
It's just the eye roll is just like, how did we get here? I don't know. I mean, honestly.
But George,
one of my objects someday is to write a book about this and try to figure out how it all happened. Not on a personal level.
That would be a great book. My question to you is, in 2016, your ex-wife being one of the people who actually believed that he could win, they were looking deeply at the numbers in some of the swing states like Wisconsin and Michigan and, elsewhere. We're going to be 8 years from there. And what kind of an impact do you think, the complete takeover of the party now, as opposed to 2018 by Trump, that together with the fact that he's been convicted, and by the way, unfair trial, most defendants who were intimidating witnesses and violating gag orders the way that Trump did would have been thrown in jail.
Great point, Kathleen.
Is watching an episode of Law and Order to know that. The day after the conviction, they hauled in, super PACs hauled in $50-60 million in the aftermath of the conviction. So tell us, we got it all of us got it wrong in 2016 for whatever reason. Now, what do you think, in your opinion?
All right. Well, here's my simplistic take on the last two and the current presidential election. Hillary lost in 2016 because the election became about Hillary. And, the Trump lost in 2020 because the election became about him. Trump is going to lose in 2024 because the Biden campaign and the fact that he can't help himself. He's such a narcissist. He wants to make everything about himself. And, these legal proceedings, he's now a convicted felon, an adjudicated fraudster, an adjudicated rapist. And, again, as we were discussing, repetition is important. I think those words need to be brought into play whenever you're referring to convicted felon Donald Trump. You have to say convicted felon Donald Trump. I think he's going to lose this election for that reason as well. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be scared or we shouldn't be that we should be in any way complacent. Because that complacency is the kiss of death. I think what has to happen is that people have to keep pounding on this guy. And I think there is a tendency to go back to the question of whether Democrats message effectively. I think there's a tendency among people who are critics of Trump to say, well, we said that already. Nobody's listening. We said he was a bad guy. We said he talked about suckers and the troops being suckers and losers. I said the other day he was a convicted felon and he hasn't dropped a zero in the polls. It's like, no, you have to keep pounding it day in and day out because people don't tune in to politics. They're busy with their everyday lives. They just get little bits and pieces of information here and there, and you don't have a lot of time to get their attention, which is why you have to say, he's an adjudicated rapist. He's a convicted felon.
What I don't understand, though, George, is I don't understand why his base is like the alpha male tough guy, right? It's right. Guys in the military, ex-military, cops, whatever. He sits there and calls them all losers. He literally like trashes them to their face, and they still support him. And whether it was Bill Barr, who same thing, right? He trashes him to his face. I'll never forget the interview with Caitlin Collins was talking to Bill Barr, and she asks him, to his face on the air, that how is it that you still support this guy who literally, when you said you supported him, he still called you a loser? Like, what? I don't understand. Like, what is this cult of personality, and why do people still follow him? And just really quick, this whole convicted felon thing that you talk about, what worries me a little bit about that is somehow everyone's conflated Hunter Biden with his father. And I think soon we're going to have as soon as you say, oh, convicted felon, they'll say, oh, but this is a convicted felon, whatever. Like, I just think people are becoming a little numb to it as well. But I go ahead.
I mean, I don't think it's going to matter. The Hunter Biden case is going to matter, but I agree. I understand your point about people. Basically, he abuses people and yet they still support him. That's what narcissists do. That's how narcissists roll. That's why you have spousal abuse. That's why you have. It's the same dynamic. People often kowtow and stick to people who abuse them, because they don't want the abuse of they don't want the abuse of leaving and then getting abused even more. I mean, there is kind of a sick relationship between Trump and his supporters. And the abuse he heaps on them and others it binds them to him in a way. I mean, I remember watching people in the White House, and they were bound to him. Even he was, he wasn't always nice to people in the White House, but he bound them to him because if they didn't go out on TV and defend him, they get castigated by him. And then, so they'd go out and they'd say crazy things on television to please him. And then they get castigated by rational people and by the media. And that had this weird effect of binding them, kind of like a Stockholm syndrome thing, to Trump. And there's a lot of that going on. And also there's this desire to, this desire to basically have a strong leader, even though he really isn't strong, and he's not much of a leader because he's a complete imbecile. But when you have one person just declaring the truth and just declaring simplistic lies, it makes life simpler because you don't have to think. And that's what a lot of Trumpists like about Trump, is that they don't have to think anymore. They don't have to think about gray areas anymore. My side is good. The other side is bad. The other side is always lying. And, you then tune out and ignore the uncomfortable facts. Another aspect of the Trumpist, psychology is they have this visceral hatred of people they perceive, they think themselves better than them. They feel inferior, or they feel that the rest of the world thinks them inferior. And so when people get mad about Trump, those people who the Trumpists hate, they like that. And that's one of the things I think the Democrats need to learn is you can't get mad about Trump or just express it as fear of Trump or anger at Trump or loathing of Trump, although you're reasonably entitled to do that. You have to laugh at Trump. You have to mock Trump. You have to make him look weak. You have to make, you have to show your contempt for him. And that demoralizes the MAGA base. And that's why I think, things like what Jimmy Kimmel did at the Oscars is much more effective than, screaming about how Trump wants to destroy the world and so on and so forth. I think humor is going to be very, very important with this. I mean, think of the fall of the Soviet Union. It's like, one of the things we learned about the Soviet Union was people were just joking about the regime in Russia. There's countless jokes about Brezhnev and countless jokes about and all the ailing Russian leaders and about the regime. You don't see that about Putin. Okay, I don't think people make jokes about Putin because they're too afraid. But once you start making jokes about an authority, that person loses authority, and that's the thing that especially in the minds of people who have an authoritarian bent. So I think anyway. That's my pop psychology, pop political psychology analysis of Trumpism, which I think went beyond the scope of the question.
This is why I like following you on X, because there's a little bit of levity and a space where sometimes feels very, very heavy. But I appreciate your pop psychology. I think there's definitely so much to it. I mean, you certainly see on the personal level, that people are you see the blowback, right, when they dare to question the fearless leader, and then on writ large, his followers
they're angry.
Buy into this alternative reality. Yeah. I mean, calling military detainees and prisoners of war, calling them losers and suckers, there's good sourcing for that. I think John Kelly, his former chief of staff, military hero and father of a fallen soldier himself, is one of the sources. But people just say, no, he didn't say that, when, in the face of clear proof. So you're up against a lot, but I do appreciate the constant stream of levity on your feed, mixed in with stories about your corgis and and other things that make it a little less heavy all the time.
I agree. I want to ask your opinion, if it's okay with you guys, about what the heck is going on with the Supreme Court. Why are they taking so long to decide the presidential immunity? What are they going to do? What's going to happen to the case, the Jan 6 case? Like, that used to be a court that had so much respect, and I'd love to get your thoughts on all of that.
Well, I think, and I could be wrong. I can be Pollyannish, I must say, as you know. I think the immunity case is going to come out all right substantively in the end. I don't think there are the votes to create some kind of an immunity for Trump or any president that's going to eliminate these charges. I do think, and I was persuaded by Trevor Morrison of the former dean of the NYU Law School, who's a liberal, there have to be some limitations on the ability to charge a former president. I mean, it would be bad if Congress were to pass a statute that basically infringed upon inherent Article 2 authority and made it a crime, basically punished a president for exercising true Article 2 prerogatives that the Constitution allows the president to exercise. But that's not this case. But I do understand that, if you are writing an opinion for all time, if I were writing an opinion, I'd want to leave open the idea that there could be some circumstances. They're unimaginable in my view, but suppose that you made it a capital crime for a president to order a drone strike on an enemy, and if it accidentally killed an American or actually, I mean, there could be some crazy law that Congress could pass that would infringe upon, an important power of the presidency and cripple the presidency or harm it in some significant way. That's not this case. And that's the thing that bothers me about what's happening with the Supreme Court is you can leave the door open, but you can do it by saying we are ruling on the facts of particular cases. I mean, that's the reason why judges, you cannot, one of the things the Supreme Court I think has gotten into in recent years is trying to pronounce law in the abstract that governs all future cases, even the ones not before them. And frankly, I think they got that, the conservatives are doing that, and they got that from the liberals. Okay. I mean, I think, for example, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's critique of Roe v. Wade was actually I think was a very, very compelling one, which was basically they wrote a statute. They tried to decide cases that weren't before them. The idea being they thought they could resolve everything for all time. Instead, they made something that was controversial, and people ended up fighting over for decades. It's better just to decide one case at a time, make it simple. And I think that's the mistake that's going on here, is that some people don't. I also think the other problem that's going on with the Supreme Court is, look, you can't. The Supreme Court is like herding cats. These are 9 separate law firms essentially. And you can't make. They just can't make. It takes a certain will to decide we're going to put aside our differences and rule 9-0 on something. That's just not there for this. At the end of the day, though, I mean, I was very heartened by Justice Barrett's questions when she went through, and I think she did a very nice job of this, particularizing things that were actually in the indictment in the January 6th case in D.C. and saying, is that an official act? Is that an official act? She drew some concessions from Trump's lawyer. So I think at the end of the day, it's going to be a reasonable ruling. And the problem is it means that the trial probably could not get underway before September or October.
Yeah. Well, if the justices follow that path that she charted, Justice Barrett, I guess that's the only way forward, really, with a pre-election trial. And that, look, she got those concessions, as you said. Yeah.
I'll throw out one other Pollyannish possibility, is if the Supreme Court gets hung up on figuring on what's the difference between an official act and an unofficial act, and then tries to, in the abstract, set some kind of a guideline that then requires the district court to do like it had to do in the Blazingame case, the civil January 6th case, of figuring out what's official and what's not. There's no reason why she can't just conduct a hearing on that. In fact, it would seem like that would be the thing to do, in which case I would say, if I were Judge Kutkin and I were faced with that, hey, Mr. Smith, let's see what you got. Come show up in court on July 15 with your first witness, and you'd have a mini trial. And I think that could serve the function of airing some of this evidence that we haven't seen yet, that I think could be quite interesting. So that there could be a silver lining if in a decision that's less than that is less than what we want it to be.
Yeah, just for at least getting the evidence out there, but short of, obviously that would be.
I don't think we're going to get a conviction. I mean, we're past being able to get a conviction before the election. Yeah. And frankly, I have to say, one of the things that I did not anticipate before this last trial would happen was that last trial helped him in a very funny way, temporarily. It drew attention away from him. It drew attention away from the crazy things he says day in and day out. And, when he's out on the campaign trail, one of the advantages that he has had since January 6th, frankly, is that we've seen less of him. He was deplatformed. He was no longer president. And I think one of the reasons why, the race seems closer than I think it ultimately will be, is that people have forgotten about Donald Trump. They've forgotten who he was. They've forgotten the reasons why they didn't like him. They've forgotten the reasons why his own White House staff in the COVID spring of 2020 had to pull him out of those briefings and end those coronavirus briefings because they were so bad and so harmful to his image because he was saying such insane things. So I think the more exposure to Trump,
that's when he was saying, like, inject yourself
with right. No, those things became a disaster and became a liability.
I forgot about that.
Yeah, and it's like the more you see of him, the more you say, what is wrong with him? And he's much, much sicker than he was in 2020, and certainly than in 2016. Because if you play some of what he was saying in 2016, and then play some of what what people apparently do. Last night while I was at the Celtics game, he had another rally that was just absolutely off the wall, where he's rambling on about sharks or something. I don't know. He's really off the rails, and people need to see that. And one of the disadvantages of the most recent trial is it delayed the moment where they really, really see him for real. And hopefully I think that's going to change with the debate, with the conventions. And it may not be necessarily the worst thing in the world that these trials get kicked off to next year. When he will no longer be a candidate for president, I think, and when he will no longer be a viable candidate for president, he will remain private citizen Trump. And I believe and hope that he'll spend the rest of his life in prison, because that's where he belongs.
It's crazy.
Yep.
When do you think the Supreme Court is going to give us their decision?
What's the last day of the term? I think the last day of the term is like June 20. It's going to be one of those last days, because it's like it's going to be. You've got a bunch of people writing opinions and they're fussing over it, and once you get them in that mode, it's going to be one of. At this point, what's the difference? I mean, we're in the beginning of June. It's going to be like the last day of the term. We're all going to be sitting there.
We got a couple other good ones too, right? The Fisher one.
No, it's interesting. Yeah. Fisher one. Yeah. Although I don't think that's going to necessarily affect
that one
too. I don't know. I mean, I think that I don't know. I have to go back through it, but I don't think Fisher's going to really hurt that.
So Fisher is the one where it just so people who aren't as in the weeds as we are. Fisher is the case.
Well, I'm lost in the weeds, I have to say.
I know, but Fisher is the case where Judge Nickel, who was the trial judge in Washington, D.C., held for Mr. Fisher, who was one of the Jan 6 people who was prosecuted, and the others held that obstruction of official proceeding did not apply to the conduct of January 6th, essentially. And so all of the Jan 6 defendants who appeared before Judge Nickel, he essentially dismissed those charges. It then got reversed by the DC Circuit, who said, no, you're wrong. All the other judges who said obstruction of an official proceeding was an appropriate charge, and so reinstated those charges. And then now the Supreme Court is considering it. The reason that's significant is because Donald Trump, 2 of his charges are this particular charge. So it's right. going to come down to whether.
But at the end of the day, I think it's going to, whatever the Supreme Court does, they can't possibly say that something involving an effort to obstruct an official proceeding using false documentation. I mean, that no matter how you construe that statute, no matter how narrowly you can't possibly say that that's not covered by the statute. And at the end of the day,
the bottom line is Fisher was about the rioters, and so
the rioters, right? And here,
and this particular statute was created because of you have to have some kind of physical document that you are using to obstruct this official proceeding. And I think what you're saying, George and Danya, is that for Donald Trump, because he was trying to utilize fake electors,
correct,
to obstruct the official proceeding, that even in that situation, this charge will still stick. But with the guys who are breaking windows and assaulting police officers, maybe not so much them. That even if Fisher is decided, it won't apply to Trump.
Yeah.
Am I getting that right?
Absolutely.
Yep. And I think there are at least 3 justices, Alito, Gorsuch, and Thomas, who seemed, ready, willing, and able to, to get rid of the whole statute as applied to, I don't know how many, but many dozens of rioters. So that's potentially worrisome.
George, speaking of Alito, what do you think? Do you think he should recuse himself from the Jan 6 cases, given his upside down flag, his clear affiliation or empathy or sympathy towards MAGA with the double flag issue, right? The upside down flag and then the green tree, whatever that thing is called, flag. But do you think he should recuse from the January 6 cases? And what about Thomas, given his wife and her affiliation with that? Do you see that they should have to recuse?
Yeah, with Thomas, I didn't feel that recusal was warranted because, he didn't do it. And she was just, she didn't commit any offenses, and it wasn't clear that she was advocating the commission of offenses. And this is a woman who, frankly, for many years has sent around very, very strange emails and is well known for sending very strange emails. And she used and listservs. It goes back a very long time. The Alito thing, and I feel more strongly about because this was his house. This was this was a flag flown outside his house, 2 flags, 2 houses. And if you apply that standard, whether a justice or a judge's impartiality can reasonably be questioned. These were effectively statements being made by him or on his behalf, even if his wife did it, he was driving into the house every day. And so I do think that there's a strong argument for that. That said, I can't get as upset about that as I get upset about Thomas, and not the January 6th stuff with regard to Thomas. What the thing that most disturbs me about the current ethics issues involving the Supreme Court is the amount of money and gift. The gifts that Thomas has accepted. The millions of dollars. So much more than any other justice. It's just mind-boggling to me and deeply offensive. And I'm shocked. I am shocked as someone who, as I personally have been fond of Justice Thomas. I don't agree with everything he does. I'm more like a Scalia, but more Scalia-like in my. If I were a justice, I would be more Scalia-like, more of a what Scalia called a faint-hearted originalist, as opposed to the gung-ho, all-in originalist that Thomas is. But none of that matters. If any justice, I don't care whether I don't care which justice it is. If Sotomayor or Kagan had done this, I can't. The clamor among Republicans, and rightly so, if they had accepted millions of dollars in gifts, and possibly, I don't know, do you think he actually paid taxes on the $250,000 RV loan that he did that was forgiven? I'd like to see those tax returns. The Republicans will be clamoring for the resignation of any Democratic appointee who had done anything remotely similar. And I think of the poor late Justice Abe Fortas, who was, who took, I guess, speech money. I don't know what it was. It was for a fraction of what we're talking about, and he was compelled to leave the court. So that's what really, really upsets me. Not this flag stuff, frankly. I think that, I honestly do think that Alito and Thomas, I do think Alito was going to vote the way he was going to vote no matter what. I don't think it's, but anyway, those are my random thoughts.
Well, we appreciate your random thoughts and your incredible insight. And frankly, George, you give us hope when you say that you think he's going to lose this election, because it really is terrifying what he has planned for our country. And so thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for taking the time to chat with the three of us and for joining the MissTrial podcast. So we very much
congratulations on the podcast, and I like the logo.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We hope you'll come back again. We loved having you.
Love to.
Thanks, George.
Thank you, George.
Love this video? Make sure you stay up to date on the latest breaking news and all things Midas by signing up to the Midas Touch newsletter at MidasTouch.com/newsletter.